99% think karma takes lifetimes. The truth is it happens right now. According to the Buddha's analysis of suffering, we suffer because of three kinds of craving: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. In every case, the Buddha says, these kinds of craving lead to more becoming. The question is, how do we get around them? How do we get rid of them? After all, the path to the end of suffering will require desire as well. We've got the added problem that you would think that craving for non-becoming would help get rid of becoming. But becoming is basically taking an identity in a world of experience. And the craving for non-becoming thinks in terms of identities and worlds of experience. Even though it wants to destroy them, it ends up dealing in terms of becoming and creating more becoming into the future. The trick lies in learning how to express your desire in terms that have nothing to do with identities or worlds of experience. That's what the teaching on dependent co-arising is all about. We look at the raw materials that lead up to becoming and try to get to them before they take on an identity as a world of experience or as an identity of who you are. And although the list in dependent co-arising is long, certain basic principles hold across the board. The number one principle is that you don't ask who is doing the actions in dependent co-arising, and you don't ask where they're happening. In fact, the different factors in the process of dependent co-arising are meant to show you how your whole idea of an identity comes about, how your idea of a world comes about. So you want to look at those factors simply as events. As the Buddha said, they're events happening right here, right now. They condition one another right here, right now. In some cases, the conditioning is immediate. X happens and Y happens immediately. When X stops, Y stops. In other cases, the conditioning takes place over time. But the Buddha never talks about how long that span of time might be. It could be just a couple of instants. It could be a couple of lifetimes. That's not the issue, because once you start thinking about how long it's going to be, you start thinking in terms of the world. And the number one way of making sure you deal properly with dependent co-arising is to make sure you don't think in terms of worlds. You don't think in terms of identities. You stay with just phenomena happening, conditioning one another right here, immediately present to your experience. You don't have to think of anything hiding behind the phenomena, or of there being nothing behind the phenomena, because that starts you thinking in terms of identities and worlds all over again. Another important thing to notice about dependent co-arising is that it starts with ignorance. Ignorance is defined as not seeing things in terms of the Four Noble Truths, because you're basically seeing things in terms of your identity in a world. If you look in terms of the Four Noble Truths, there's no mention of identities or worlds at all. Just what the suffering is, what's causing it, and whether its cessation is possible. The Buddha's approach is that you attack the cause, and because the cause is conditioned, it can change, it can cease. There's also a path that attacks that cause and leads to the cessation. Again, no reference to who you are, or how large the time scale is, or how big the world is in which this is happening. It could be happening in your mind. It could be playing out in the world outside. It's the same principle all over. As the Buddha said, with all the different factors in dependent co-arising, you bring this type of analysis to any of the factors prior to clinging, and you can nip the whole process in the bud. So what are the factors? Half of them are prior to sensory contact. That's another important thing to notice. Most of the causes for our suffering are things that we bring to our experience. Now, this is good news. If the suffering were caused by our experiences, by the world outside, how could we put an end to suffering? How could you change the world enough to make sure you didn't suffer? You look at people who try to make big changes in the world that way, and they end up doing a lot of damage as they find people getting in their way, and they just run right over them. It was the Buddha's insight that even though he was born in the noble warrior class, which tended to see problems in that perspective, he said, no, the real problem is inside. He said, the arrow is in the heart. So you have to turn around and pluck the arrow out. This means looking at the way in which you approach experience, and if you approach it with knowledge, in other words, seeing all of the things leading up to sensory contact in terms of the Four Noble Truths, you won't have to suffer because you're not going to be giving rise to the craving that causes more becoming. So what have you got? Starting with ignorance. Ignorance conditions fabrications. These can be bodily fabrication, the breath, verbal fabrication, the way you talk to yourself, and mental fabrication, perceptions and feelings. That's on the immediate level as you're sitting here meditating. But then there's also the bodily, verbal, and mental fabrication that creates karma going on to new births. The same principle operating on a larger timescale. The important thing is that you can see the larger factors right here. After all, if you're going to move your body, you have to breathe. If you're going to speak, you have to talk to yourself first. If you're going to think, you've got to use perceptions and feelings. This illustrates an important principle here, that the patterns of causality on the large scale are the same as those on the small scale. If you want to know the large scale, you can watch the small scale right here as you meditate. For instance, while you're focused on the breath right here, you've got all three forms of fabrication. You can choose to approach them with ignorance, or you can choose to approach them with knowledge. With ignorance, you're saying, here I am trying to meditate, and you judge how good a person you are by how well the meditation is going. It all becomes you in the world of experience. But you could also meditate looking at these things simply as fabrications. Here's the breath. Here are these processes in the mind, directed thought and evaluation. And there are perceptions that hold, identify the breath, and then the feelings that come as you stay with the breath or don't stay with the breath. Feelings of pleasure or feelings of dis-ease. But you can convert them to more feelings of pleasure if you use the right perceptions. So here's an immediate way of dealing with dependent co-arising. You don't have to know the whole series. Just focus on what you're doing right now and put your sense of self out of the way. Put your ideas of world, in other words, how you compare with other people, what you're going to do after you leave the meditation. Put all of that aside, and then you can look. Is the breath pleasant or unpleasant? If it's unpleasant, what's causing it to be unpleasant? Is there some imbalance in the elements in the body? Or is it an imbalance in activities in the mind? Look at the way you're talking to yourself. Look at the perceptions you're holding in mind. Maybe you should try a different perception. When you're thinking in these immediate terms, you're bringing knowledge to these processes so that instead of being a cause for suffering, they're actually a path to the cessation of suffering. Then these fabrications, in turn, will affect your consciousness. Your consciousness will affect name and form. Name and form is basically the 5 aggregates. And those are right here too, simply that fabrication is divided up here into a few other categories: attention, intention, and contact. You look at how you pay attention to the breath. You can look at your intentions in staying with the breath. You look at how your perceptions and your attention and your intentions all play off one another. And again, you keep you out of the picture and simply look at what's causing what to happen here. Then you pass judgment. Is this good? Is it not good? If it's not good, what can be done to change it? That's bringing knowledge to these processes. These are the things that condition your senses, and then from the senses, they condition the contact you have with the world. The pattern of dependent co-arising then goes on from there. From contact, there's feeling. From feeling, there's craving. From craving, there's clinging. From clinging, there's becoming. Once you've got becoming, there's birth, aging, illness, death, with all their attendant suffering. But notice that the really important factors are prior to sensory contact. And where do you deal with those factors? You deal with them as you meditate. This is why, when we meditate, we're not contemplating big abstract truths. We're simply here to watch the workings of the mind to see what conditions what and how those conditions can be moved in a good direction. All the time keeping our sense of us as much in the background as possible. Keeping our sense of the world as much in the background as possible. That's when you're turning these factors of dependent co-arising from conditions for suffering into factors of the path. So you've still got desire. It's not as if you pretend that you don't want to come to the end of the path, that you don't want to put an end to suffering, or that you don't want to put an end to the different forms of craving. I was listening the other night to somebody saying just that the Buddha puts you in a bind. He tells you that you suffer because of sensuality, craving for sensuality. But if you crave to have an end to sensuality, that's a craving for non-existence, and that's a form of suffering too. So the solution, the person said, was just not having any desire at all. Of course, why would you not want to have desire? Because you want to put an end to suffering. You're being dishonest with yourself. But that wasn't the Buddha's approach. He said we suffer because we approach things thinking in terms of becoming, our identity in a world of experience. So change the way you frame your desires. Tell yourself you want to understand the fabrications of the mind, the workings of the mind, and get you and the world out of the picture as much as possible. Acting on that kind of desire gives results. So even though dependent co-arising is complex, and there's that famous passage where Ananda comes to the Buddha and says, "It looks complex, but it's really simple." And the Buddha said, "No, it really is complex. It's because it's so complex that we get entangled in suffering. Still, you can take it apart, break it down, so that it becomes a manageable teaching." And the Buddha's primary way of doing this is focusing on the breath, seeing the breath as bodily fabrication, seeing the events in the mind as mental fabrication, engaging in verbal fabrication, with as little you in there as possible. And that can be enough to cause this whole pattern of causes and conditions leading to suffering to begin to unravel. So keep your focus right here. Keep the way you frame the issues right here, and your desire for the end of suffering can become a reality. Feeding frenzy, dependent co-arising. The Pali word for the worlds we create in the mind is bhava, which literally means becoming. We keep creating these worlds. If you look at dependent co-arising, you see that they're based on two things. The immediate prerequisite is clinging, upadana, and clinging in turn is based on craving, tanha. But both of those words have another meaning. The word for clinging can also mean feeding, taking sustenance, and the word for craving means thirst. The mind is thirsting for things, And so it latches onto the 5 aggregates and tries to feed off them. Form, feeling, perception, thought fabrications, and sensory consciousness. These are the things we feed on. When we're meditating, we're trying to create a good bhava, a good place for the mind to stay in the present moment. If you create a world for yourself that maintains its reference to the present, then it's a lot easier to see what that world depends on in the present as well. In other words, you can see the process of thirsting and feeding as it's happening. That enables you to see through the process so that you don't get misled by the worlds you create. When you create worlds of the past and future, though, you have to block out large parts of your present awareness in order to stay focused on those little worlds. That's why they're not helpful in the meditation. They're helpful only to the extent of enabling you to remember things you did in the past or anticipate in the future that help focus you back on the present. In other words, you can remember the times when you were mindless, not very alert, and you can reflect on the damage it caused. Or you can reflect on the dangers that await you in the future if you're not mindful and alert. This kind of thinking is helpful because it motivates you to get back to the present moment, to develop your powers of mindfulness and alertness right now. If you want to see these processes in action, you've got to watch in the present moment. So you create the world out of the breath, your inner sense of the body. Take the sensations you feel in the legs and the arms, etc., and try to fashion them into a basis for concentration, a place where the mind can stay, that you can take as your dwelling. The sense of ease and fullness you can develop through the breath can help to alleviate your thirst. It gives you something good and nourishing to feed on. The texts actually talk about feeding on rapture. In the midst of a world of hungry people, the Buddha said, we feed on rapture like the radiant gods. And he's not just talking about hungry, in the sense of hungry for physical food. If you look at what's going on in the world, if you read the newspapers and news magazines, you see what people are doing from their sense of psychological hunger. And it's not a pretty sight. When we say that in the midst of hungry people, we're feeding on rapture like the radiant gods, it's not a selfish or narrow pleasure. We're trying to get ourselves out of that feeding frenzy. This process of psychological feeding is a process we have to understand in the mind. How does this happen? The Buddha says that there are 4 ways of clinging or feeding inside. 1 is simply feeding on sensual desire. You can think about situations you'd like to have in your life that would make you feel pleasant, that you would derive some pleasure from. You can think about times in the past when you had pleasures, or about pleasures you anticipate in the future, and the mind feeds off of that. There's also feeding on views, clinging to views. Then, as you've probably noticed, there's a strong sense of me or mine around the clinging, feeding on the identity you build around your views. I'm the person who has the right views. I'm the person who understands things better than other people. My take on things is right. Then there's feeding on certain ways of doing things, your habits and practices, your particular way of doing things that you feel is the right way of doing things in and of itself. Now, some of these forms of food are actually part of the path. You need to have views for the path. You need to develop certain habits and follow certain practices as part of the path. You also need to develop a certain sense of yourself as capable of following the path. The Buddha doesn't criticize these things at their proper time and place. What he does criticize is feeding on these things as ends in and of themselves. Why does the mind feed on these things? Because it feels empty without them. Sometimes it feels lost without them, deprived of its bearings. We create our bearings for ourselves through our views, through our ways of doing things. What it comes down to is that we think we need these things for our happiness. Without them, we feel lost. These are our means, we think, for obtaining pleasure. These attitudes are based on thirst. The thirst for sensuality, the thirst for becoming, or the thirst to destroy what we've got. But all these things are motivated by a desire for happiness, by a desire for well-being. The thirst, in turn, is conditioned by feelings of pleasure or pain, or neither pleasure nor pain, a neutral feeling. And these come from sensory contact. One way of understanding the processes in the mind is try to trace them back. Exactly what contact triggered them? Was there a thought? Was there a sound? Was there an idea that suddenly triggered you into creating these worlds? That's one thing you've got to look for. What are the triggers? Sometimes you find the triggers can be very small, but dependent co-arising digs deeper than that. It says that the issue is not just the contact. We come to sensory contact with a lot of preconceived notions, a lot of attitudes ready to pounce on things. This is why contact is not the beginning of dependent co-arising. Prior to contact, you've got the senses, and prior to the senses, you've got name and form. Name and form are crucial here, particularly name, for it includes feelings, perceptions, intentions, attention, and the contact among these things in the mind. This is why the Buddha focuses the practice of the path right here, at the processes of name. You've got to change your intention. You've got to change the way you understand things. Which things you pay attention to, which things you ignore. Our usual approach for happiness is that you identify with certain things, your sense of who you are, who's going to benefit from these efforts you're making to create happiness, and exactly what things you have under your power, under your control, that can be used to create that happiness. That's all an issue of attention. How you attend to things, how you look at them, what your perspective is, what questions you ask, and that big question, the question of I. Who am I? Do I exist? Do I not exist? That's a constant question, and we're always coming up with different answers, because that question eats at us. We try to create an identity to stuff into its mouth, but you can learn to stop feeding on it if you can keep reminding yourself that that's not the issue. The issue is simply what can be done to lead to happiness, which sometimes requires a sense of self, but sometimes doesn't. This is why right view is the beginning of the path, because it focuses particularly on the most skillful way of attending to things. Once you've got a skillful way of attending to things, that changes your intentions. The focus of your attention should be to understand what is the cause of suffering. What are the causes for the end of suffering? If I see myself doing something that leads to suffering, how can I stop? If I see that there are states of mind that lead to an end to suffering, how can I encourage them? How can I develop them? Those are intentions that you've got to nourish. Otherwise, when the usual triggers for craving and clinging or thirst and feeding come along, you go right back to your old feeding patterns. So, to help strengthen the new way of giving attention, or the new way of developing intentions, the Buddha has you develop certain perceptions. You've probably heard of the 3 characteristics, but it's interesting to note that the term 3 characteristics doesn't appear in the Pali Canon. The Buddha talks about anicca, dukkha, and anatta, but he doesn't use the word for characteristic, lakkhana, to go along with them. He uses the word perception or mental label, anicca sanya, dukkha sanya, anatta sanya. You learn to label things as inconstant, stressful, not self. The other word he connects with them is anupassana, or contemplation, aniccanupassana. To contemplate is to look for these qualities in your experiences. In particular, you look at the raw materials that you ordinarily use to build your sense of yourself, to build your sense of the world, to see how they're inconstant. When the raw materials are inconstant, how are you going to build anything solid out of them? It's like building a house out of frozen meat. The meat seems solid. You can stack it like bricks, but it's going to melt. Who would want to live in a house like that? It's stressful. It's asking for disaster. So you look for the stress inherent in trying to find happiness in things that are inconstant. When you see the raw materials as stressful, ask yourself, what can I build out of stressful things that would really provide true security? And when you see that they're not totally under your control, when they're anatta, what sense of reliable self could you build out of these things? You can build a temporary sense of self, and there are times when you need that. But ultimately, it doesn't give the satisfaction you want. That's because these thought worlds, once you've set them going, start doing things on their own. They have a logic of their own, which you can't always anticipate. So how can you trust them? These are the factors the Buddha has you focus on: attention, intention, and perception, so that when you catch the mind jumping at the opportunity to build a thought world, you can ask yourself, why am I doing this? What am I going to get out of it? You look at the raw materials and you see that they're not the sort of things you could build anything reliable out of. Then you look at your motivation. Why are you doing this? What do you want out of this? You start asking the Buddha's questions. Does this activity lead to suffering, or does it lead away from suffering? These are the things you've got to keep in mind. One way of doing that is to develop a good solid foundation here in the present, so that it's easier to stay in the present. The longer the mind stays in the present, the easier it is to be mindful and alert. The more mindful and alert it is, the more clearly it can see these processes as they're happening. Dig down a few more steps into dependent co-arising, and you come to fabrication. Fabrication comes in three kinds: bodily, verbal, and mental. Bodily fabrication is the breath. Verbal fabrication is directed thought and evaluation. And mental fabrication is feeling and perception. When you're focused on the breath, thinking about and evaluating the breath, you've got all these things right there. You've got the breath, you've got yourself thinking and evaluating the breath, and you've got the feelings of pleasure and pain that come from the breath, along with perceptions that keep you focused both on the breath and on the pleasures or the pains that come from the breath. When you learn to look at things in these terms and can maintain this world, you're in a much better position to watch the process of how the mind creates other worlds. When it forgets, when it tries to block out this world of the present, that's the ignorance that sets those other thought worlds into motion. You've got to keep reminding yourself, stay here, stay here, stay here. Try to get as interested in the breath as you can. Try to understand, what is this bodily fabrication, this breath energy anyhow? How does the in and out breath relate to the sense of energy in the different parts of the body? How can you create a sense of ease here that helps to satisfy you, that helps get rid of that hunger to go out and create other places, other worlds to go foraging in? The greater the sense of fullness you've got here, the fullness that comes from learning how to relate properly to the breath, the more you can cut through the hunger, the thirst, that would force you to create other worlds of being, other worlds of becoming. So when you look at dependent co-arising, it's not just an abstract exercise. It actually explains a lot of the reasons why the Buddha teaches meditation the way he does, why he tended to teach breath meditation more than any other kind of meditation, and why the path begins with right view. Right view helps redirect this causal process away from the ignorant clinging and thirst that ordinarily we feed on, or that we try to feed on, trying to find some satisfaction, and focuses it in a direction where it provides more satisfaction, a greater sense of fullness. Dependent co-arising is not just a map about abstractions. It's actually a map of your feeding frenzy. Even though the map has lots of factors that even the Buddha admitted are all entangled, it does make one clear and simple point. When contact hits, it's not just making a mark on a blank slate or a passive mirror. The mind is already primed to go looking for food even before contact happens. When we encounter contact, our main question is whether we can eat it. This is why we have to meditate. The causes for suffering are inside, and this is why the Buddha has us focus attention on our intentions, perceptions, and views, because as long as we're ignorant of these things, that ignorance keeps driving our feeding frenzy, which is why dependent co-arising is also a guide to what you can do to help abort this process of constantly creating unsatisfactory feeding worlds in the mind, worlds that lead to suffering, worlds that lead to stress. It teaches us new feeding habits. When we learn how to feed on the breath, we don't have to create the different identities that need to go out and engage in a feeding frenzy on other people. It's good, not just for us, but also for everyone around us. So develop a taste for the breath. Learn how to be a connoisseur of your breathing. When you learn to feed here, you really develop the various strengths of the mind: conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment that can strengthen it to the point where ultimately it doesn't need to feed anymore. That's a great gift right there, both to yourself and to everyone around you.